The topic we are covering is individual constraints. Before we get into detail about individual constraints, we need to understand the basic definition of constraints. First, it is important to know that constraints are not a negative concept. Research from J. Van Kallenberg has shown that not all constraints are detrimental to individuals and can even help them thrive and improve their quality of living. Constraints are limiting or restrictive factors that define how a particular movement is performed. They provide insight and information about our physical movements. They can be classified as individual, environmental, or task-related. According to D.J. Langley in the Journal of Aging and Physical Activity, the use of our physical movements for optimal skill development that requires both freedom to move the limbs in relation to the demands of the task and opportunities to engage in practice over an extended time span. This can all be related back to constraints. Individual constraints can be broken down further into two categories: structural and functional. Structural constraints change slowly over time and are related to the body's physical structure. In order to demonstrate structural constraints, we have two participants. Jeremy is representing Team Maryland, while Brendan is representing Duke. This is our first participant, Jeremy, who's representing Team Maryland. And our second participant, Brendan, who's representing Team Duke.
Hey, you suck!
Some more examples of structural constraints are height, weight, muscle mass, and bone length. Representing our first individual constraint under the structural subdivision is that Jeremy has much longer bones than Brendan and is obviously much taller than him. A second example of a structural constraint would be weight. Brendan is clearly much fatter than Jeremy. The second category of individual constraints is the functional constraints. Functional constraints are related to aspects of behavior. Here are some examples. An example of an individual constraint under the functional subdivision would be flexibility. As you can see, Jeremy is clearly much more flexible than Brendan is, who's struggling to reach his toes. Another example of a functional constraint would be motivation. Brendan clearly lacks it.
Honey, it's time to get up!
5 more minutes, Mom.
As you can see, Jeremy is clearly much more motivated than Brendan. Our final example is a combination of both structural and functional constraints. The structural portion is that Jeremy has much more muscle mass than Brendan does, while the functional constraint is that he is stronger than Brendan, allowing him to clearly win the race. As you can clearly see with Brendan and Jeremy, constraints vary greatly from person to person. Jeremy's individual constraints allowed him to be faster, stronger, and taller, just like Maryland in the UMD versus Duke basketball game. While Brendan, on the other hand, was slower, weaker, smaller, and less motivated, clearly representing Team Duke. Constraints are an important aspect of motor development and affect all of our movements in our daily lives.